Sri Lanka under attack. Hundreds killed and injured in coordinated attacks on churches and hotels. What does it mean for this country that is still recovering from a long civil war? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Richelle Carey. Sri Lanka's Easter Sunday turned into a scene of death and destruction. Churches and luxury hotels were targeted in at least 8 coordinated blasts. Hundreds of people were killed, many as they attended Christian services. The police say the first 6 explosions happened in one wave. 2 more came hours later. They took place in the heart of the capital, Colombo, in cities of Negombo and Battic-aloa. A curfew has been imposed and major social media networks blocked. The attacks are the worst since the South Asian country's civil war ended in 2009. Sri Lanka's prime minister has vowed to take severe action against those responsible. Manil Fernandez reports from outside one of the churches attacked in Colombo.
Tragic scenes outside the locations hit by multiple explosions here on Easter Sunday in Sri Lanka. Just behind me, the St. Anthony's Church, which had been packed with believers during the Easter Sunday Mass, and now many of them lying in body bags, basically stretched out outside the church. There have been some heart-wrenching scenes as loved ones try to find out where missing family members are. There were at least 2 women who came clutching their mobile phones with pictures, giving them to workers who are bringing the bodies out to try and say, please, can you see if this person is among the dead, because we can't find them anywhere else. These kind of scenes repeated in the 2 other churches also hit by the explosions here in Sri Lanka, and also the hotels, the scene of further carnage. All the 3 explosions in the top Colombo hotels, targeting the restaurants, obviously busy on Easter Sunday at brunch, where many of the guests ended up getting injured, and there were quite a few fatalities. Now, the government has imposed an immediate police curfew island-wide. That curfew initially was due to kick in from 6 p.m. till 6 a.m., but given the situation where we heard more explosions being reported, the government brought in that curfew, brought it with immediate effect. We're also hearing that in the suburbs, Colombo suburb of Dematagoda, there was an explosion in a housing complex. Details still very sketchy, but apparently the law enforcement authorities were checking out a tip-off from one of the flats when there had been an explosion, reports of a possible shootout, and reports that 3 police personnel were killed in that explosion. So the authorities still trying to get a handle on the situation, try and find out what is going on. Still very much uncertainty going on. We're hearing from the Education Ministry that schools which were on break and due to reopen on Monday will remain closed for a further 2 days. We're hearing that universities, it will be likewise. The main international airport urging passengers to basically leave at least 4 hours before their flights. So as far as we've heard, the authorities trying to find out what has happened, what has transpired, who's behind it. Manil Fernandez for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our panel now. Joining us from Colombo on Skype, Perera, Executive Director of the National Peace Council of Sri Lanka. From London, Charu Hogg, Associate Fellow of the Asia Pacific Program at Chatham House, and visiting Michael D. Palm Fellow at the Williams Institute. And from Oxford, Gihan Gunatilaka, researcher at the Bonavera Institute of Human Rights and legal director of Verite Research in Sri Lanka. Welcome to all of you to the program, and I'm sorry it's under these circumstances. This is the worst violence that Sri Lanka has seen since going through a terrible civil war. So having said that, Gihan, how do you think Sri Lankans are processing what is happening?
I think we are viewing things with a sense of disbelief. This was totally unexpected. For 10 years, we experienced no violence of this scale, no terrorism of this scale. Our terrorism in any sense in a way. And we have been, and this country has been so free. You can go into hotels without any check. You go, even when you go into the airport, there is hardly any check. Of course, I think we were too relaxed, perhaps, but that in a way reflected the lack of social tension and anger of communities against each other, because we had, in a way, after the end of the war, there has been an accommodation and a sense of freedom and goodwill, which has now completely been shattered by what has happened.
Okay. Charu, your take on this as well. How shocking will this be to Sri Lankans?
I think Jahan is absolutely right. He's got his finger on the pulse. It's come as a massive shock to both people within Sri Lanka and outside, completely unexpected. It's also interesting that it seems almost disconnected from the narrative in Sri Lanka and the discourse in Sri Lanka. There has been tension around religion, certainly, and the Muslim minority have come under attack a lot since 2012. There have been attacks on the Christian community as well, but an attack, a very coordinated attack of this scale, including on tourism, so sort of a double-pronged attack on two institutions, the institutions of the state, which target foreign nationals as well in terms of the tourism, because it's going to have a massive impact on the economy, and the second in terms of religious sites is quite unexpected and unprecedented.
You brought up a lot of good points that we're going to come back to in this discussion. But first, I just want to start with Gihan as well. How shocking to the system is this happening on a Christian holiday? How shocking to the system, Gihan, will this be to Sri Lankans?
I think it's going to be very shocking and it is shocking, because it is unprecedented in terms of the scale of the violence and the sheer geographic nature of the violence. It happened across the island, all the way in Battic-aloa in the eastern province, and also in Colombo and places like Negombo. So the sheer scale and sophistication of the coordinated attacks, I think, is going to be very shocking. Having said that, I agree that there has been a lot of ethno-religious tension and conflict in the last 6 to 7 years, particularly targeting the Muslim community. Christian churches have been under attack for a very long time, but nothing really compares to this particular spate of attacks. And I do agree that it seems disconnected to the tensions that exist in the country. This seems to be something entirely different and entirely new.
So you and Charu both brought up that point. I want Jay's take on that. Jay, what do you think there are local tensions, and there's always, global tensions that find their way into a country. What does this feel like to you? Charu and Gihan have both said that this seems disconnected to the atmosphere in Sri Lanka. In what way?
Because, the inter-ethnic and inter-religious tension that there has been, but it is largely localized small-scale incidents. With the Muslims, it has been a little larger, but not of this vicious, diabolical nature. And now the inference is there in Sri Lanka that maybe the international terror has come to Sri Lanka, and also that the government has been remiss in permitting this by relaxing security, by not giving the military and the police the powers they need, and that therefore the government is to blame for this international terror to come into Sri Lanka. But what I find hard to figure out is, why should an international terror group want to strike Sri Lanka? What is the benefit in it for them? So I say this because several of the attackers that have been identified appear to be suicide bombers. suicide
So
bombers
if I could
are
stop you
very...
for, Jayon, let me stop you for just a moment, just to be clear with our viewers. We know at the time of this conversation, this is a rapidly developing story. At the time of this conversation, we do know that there have been some arrests, but we don't have a lot of details on those people for now, just to be clear with our viewers. We don't have a full picture now. But to your point, you're saying that if this was some sort of international attack, you're saying that that just seems odd to you to inflict on Sri Lanka. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. What is the motivation to attack Sri Lanka? Because
No, go
within
ahead.
Sri Lanka, the tensions between the religions is not of that level to warrant some international attention from international terror groups who want to strike Sri Lanka. That's what I can't understand. So therefore, my thinking is more oriented towards the Sri Lankan system itself, that something within Sri Lanka is what has brought forth this monster.
Charu, what are the questions you're asking yourself about who and why in the aftermath of this?
Absolutely. I think I would agree with my co-panelists that this is such a sort of punch in the gut and goes against all our understanding of what was and what is happening in Sri Lanka. I think for me the most there are many issues. One, this attack has happened a month before a very momentous event in the Sri Lankan history, which is on the 18th of May 2019. Next month will be 10 years, which marks the end of a very bloody conflict. And my question is, does an event like this come in the way of preventing people from a collective grieving that they are very much, they have a right to? Already there are tensions in the north and east. The north particularly is extremely militarized, and there's a lot of pressure on the Tamil community. The root causes which actually led to this sort of decade-long insurgency and civil war have not been fully resolved. Will this add another layer to the state responses, and would the state then be justified in adopting its previous and ongoing authoritarian approach in terms of using emergency legislation and rather draconian practices to get to the bottom of this? So that's one of the questions that I'm nervous about. What does it mean for people in Sri Lanka to have something so horrible happen to them in terms of their civil liberties, in terms of their political rights and their rights to expression and assembly, and a collective mourning that needs to happen? So that's, I suppose, my first question, and also what it means in terms of inter-community relationships.
Okay. I wanted to pick up on the point you said about civil liberties. Gihan, that's actually something I wanted to discuss. In the aftermath of horrible things like this, it is not uncommon for some governments, some countries to take a really hard line with people's civil liberties. They say in the interest of getting to the bottom of what happened. And because people obviously want to know what happened, they want there to be justice. But do you have similar concerns about people retaining their civil liberties and maybe the government going too far?
I do have those concerns, particularly because we have a legacy of very strong emergency powers being exercised by the government, and also counterterrorism legislation that has been used not only to target criminal elements, but also those who oppose the state, political voices particularly. But I think it is too soon to speculate as to really what the government's response is going to be, beyond really focusing on the perpetrators that have been apprehended right now. I think there's going to be a lot of fear and paranoia that envelops the country, and you can expect the government to respond to that in some fashion. I think civil liberties are certainly at risk, particularly freedom of expression and freedom of political opinion that is critical of the state. We already have a situation where curfew has been declared, and there's also some news that social media channels have been blocked. However, I want to emphasize that these are responses that may also be necessary in the short term, and I don't want to speculate as to whether there'll be long-term implications for civil liberties in general.
Okay.
Having said that, I do think that the community that might be associated with this particular attack will face prejudice, and we need to be careful as a society as we move forward that we don't let that prejudice really take control of the narrative in the aftermath of this violence.
All right, Gihan, you make some good points. So, Jayan, I want to come back to you. Gihan is saying, we can't really read too much right now into the government's response. It's literally just happened a few hours ago. But nevertheless, this government has been in conflict for, what was it, October, November, December of last year, serious conflict. Do you have confidence that politicians can work together in the best interest of Sri Lankans to figure this out and to deal with it? Or do you see that this could descend into politics and appealing to people's worst instincts?
Yes, you are correct. For the last several months, the government has been facing conflicts within itself. It was a coalition government, and in fact still is, because the president is from one party and the prime minister from another party, and they are struggling to work together. As a result, this government is seen as a somewhat weak government, a weak and indecisive government in which there are many voices. But that is also precisely the reason why this government has been good for our democracy and for our sense of freedom. My biggest worry is that this government, is the survival of this government. When I heard of this mass violence and atrocities taking place, and there were several such incidents, then the fear was, will someone want to take over? Will someone else want to take over? Because this has happened recently, where our prime minister was sacked by the president. So there is a precedent for this. I would hope not, but I'm also mindful that we are heading towards elections. The elections are due, presidential elections are due in 6 months. So what's happening now will have a bearing on those elections. And already people are talking, I hear voices saying that it's the government to blame because this government has been too soft on security. This government has been, on the other hand, too hard on the military and on the security forces, looking for accountability because of international pressures. It's listening too much to the international community. It's looking too much into human rights. It's looking too much into past war crimes. It has demoralized the military and the police. And therefore, what we need is a stronger government. So I'm concerned about the survival of this government. I would hope that this government can overcome this problem, that they will do enough fact-finding, find out who is behind this atrocity, and take the necessary action according to the rule of law.
Okay. Charu, let's talk about the Christian community, which was clearly targeted. The Christian community in Sri Lanka is made up of multiple ethnic groups. Can you tell us kind of what their place is? And as you have said, and I think Gihan said the same thing, they have been increasingly coming under attack in the last couple of years.
Yes, I mean, I think it's important to also keep in mind the unique place the Christian community has played all through the years of the Civil War. And in a way, they've been the sort of adhesive which has knit the different ethnic groups together. So you have Tamil Hindus and Tamil Christians, and the Christian community has in each of the provinces affected by the conflict, they have played a very positive role in terms of bringing being a source of comfort for affected communities, and bringing humanitarian intervention, in playing a very useful role of interlocutors in the very fumbling transitional justice process. So there is a very special place that the Christian community does occupy, and whilst, as we have discussed before, that there have been attacks on Christian sites and individuals, prominent leaders have also come under attack, it doesn't mean that they pose tension as a group. they're not demonized as a group, either politically or socially. So it's really quite bizarre on some level, and almost something that's incomprehensible to understand why such an attack would be perpetrated against this community and on their sites. So yes, it adds to the mystery of making sense of these attacks.
Gihan, is Charu just laid out a really nice picture of the role that the Christian community has in Sri Lanka and the things that they do for other people. Do you see the rest of the country rallying behind them now that this horrible thing has happened to their churches on the holiest day of the year for Christians?
I think there will be solidarity behind the Christian community. I think it's already being shown from what I've gathered on social media to some extent. I do think that the Christian community has been targeted in a sort of unprecedented manner in these attacks. It begs the question as to why any attacker will be motivated to pick on this particular minority group. Because Christians, as you will know, is a minority group in Sri Lanka. So I think no local narrative can actually explain the motivation behind these attacks. And as Jehan also mentioned, it's hard to imagine a global narrative or global motivation behind these attacks. So I think we need to explore other alternatives and try to make sense of this particular attack and ask the question as to whether Christians in Sri Lanka are being in some way instrumentalized in a sort of regional context. And I think that is what I would like to explore in terms of some of the reasons as to why here and now we're seeing Christians in Sri Lanka attacked at this level.
Jehan, I'm going to ask this last question, and I asked it last for a reason, because the loss of life is clearly the most important thing. But this was brought up in the conversation because it matters as well. Tourism, right? People love to go to Sri Lanka. It's a beautiful, beautiful country, and it seems clear that hitting the hotels has to be some sort of aim at the tourism and the economy. What would you say to someone who now feels scared?
Well, I told my children, who are very worried themselves and don't want to go to school, I said that this problem will not last. It is an event. It is an episode. It has been done for a purpose. But within our country, there is nothing to sustain this. The people don't want this. Our elites don't want this. Someone wants it, it's true, but that can be that can be stopped, because the society as a whole doesn't want this. They are not in this conflict.
Charu, do you agree with that?
Yes, absolutely. I think the social fabric, and there are many fault lines in Sri Lanka which cause simmering tensions through the country. But after living through decades of civil war and, equally, I mean, to a degree, of course, this is unprecedented, but there have been brutal attacks in the past. And I think for those of us who have been closely associated with Sri Lanka, the central bank attack, the many assassinations, they were vividly in public memory, and nobody wants a repeat of that. I think people have said no to violence. So I think something like this is not likely to find support or have resonance with people. If anything, I think it could become a binding force. The issues to guard against are that it is not manipulated against a particular community, and the government also is not manipulated to ensure a change in the political system, and all the fears that do exist about the current government do not come true.
All right, that will be the final word on this discussion. Thank you to all of you for joining me. I appreciate it very much. Jahan Perera, Charu Lata Hogg, and Gihan Gunatilaka. Thank you. And thank you for watching. You can see the program again anytime. Visit our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Richelle, Carey, and the entire team. Bye for now.